The rain had stopped hours ago, but the city still glistened like it had secrets to tell. Inside a private dining room at the top of a skyscraper, soft jazz floated above the quiet clink of crystal glasses. A billionaire, known to the public for his ruthless business genius, sat slouched in his chair, his bow tie undone, eyes heavy-lidded. To anyone watching, he looked drunk, embarrassingly so. But here sits what no one in that room knew. This wasn't sit intoxication, this was an experiment. 3 women were in attendance that night. Each believed they were there for a different reason: a job interview, a social introduction, a possible investment. What none of them understood was that every move they made was being observed, not just by the billionaire but by the silent cameras hidden in the carved wooden panels of the walls. The billionaire had spent decades building empires, negotiating with sharks, and outmaneuvering boardroom predators. But this test was different. This wasn't about corporate skill or charm, it was about something rarer. A quality so few people carried that he had learned to test for it the way a jeweler tests a diamond for authenticity. It was about character. Told his team earlier that day. The world can teach someone how to sell, how to dress, how to speak, but you can sit fake integrity when the moment comes. You either have it, or you don't sit. And tonight, he was going to find out. The first woman, let's call her Claudia, noticed the billionaire's slurred speech and his awkward grip on the wine glass. Her lips curled into a polite smile, but behind her eyes, calculations were being made. She began steering the conversation toward investment opportunities, slipping in subtle hints that his position in certain markets might be weakening, offering herself as the solution. The second, Naomi, took a different approach. She giggled at his half-formed sentences, touched his arm as if to comfort him, and whispered offers to get him home safely. Yet every touch, every tilt of her head, seemed less about concern and more about positioning herself closer to his fortune. And then, there was the maid. She wasn't supposed to be part of the evening's main company. Her name was Grace, and she'd been assigned to serve the table, refill drinks, and fade into the background. She had no idea this was a test, no clue that her every move was being watched. Halfway through the night, as the billionaire leaned forward and accidentally spilled his drink across the table, Grace stepped in, not with the brisk, professional efficiency her role required, but with something else. She crouched beside him, her voice low but steady, asking if he was all right. She didn't flinch when his eyes didn't focus on hers. She didn't roll her eyes at the inconvenience or exchange knowing glances with the other women. She simply took care of him. When she noticed his hands tremble slightly, she slid the glass away and replaced it with water, not to embarrass him, but to give him dignity. While the others continued their subtle power plays, Grace shifted the conversation back to something neutral, buying him space to gather himself. Here's what that moment teaches us. In the heat of opportunity, most people reveal their ambition. Very few reveal their humanity. The billionaire's eyes, still half closed, caught a flicker of this truth. He said nothing, but his mind logged every detail. What Grace didn't know yet was that this dinner wasn't a coincidence. She had been working in his household for less than 2 years, always quiet, never asking for favors. Her file, because yes, billionaires keep files, showed nothing remarkable except for one note from his head of staff. She has a calm way of making chaos disappear. And now in this manufactured chaos, that note was proving itself. The other women saw a drunk man to be manipulated. Grace saw a person to be protected. By the time dessert was served, the billionaire leaned back, too tired to continue the conversation. The 3 women were ushered out politely, each given a standard farewell gift bag. But before Grace could disappear back to the kitchen, his voice cut through the quiet. "Stay a moment." She froze. He looked at her for a long time, the drunken mask beginning to dissolve into something sharper, deliberate. "Do you know what just happened here tonight?" he asked. Grace shook her head. The billionaire's smile was small, almost imperceptible. "You passed a test you didn't set, even though you were taking." Long before the skyscrapers and boardrooms, before his name was etched into the glass doors of corporations, Elijah Cross was just a boy in a one-bedroom apartment above a liquor store in Atlanta. His father left when he was 9. His mother worked 2 jobs, one as a nurse's aide, the other cleaning office buildings at night. Elijah learned early what it meant to watch someone get used. When he was 13, his mother slipped on a wet floor while scrubbing the lobby of a law firm. The partners didn't check on her. They didn't pay for her medical bills. Instead, they replaced her by the end of the week, citing attendance issues. He remembered standing in their polished marble lobby, his fists balled so tight his nails dug into his palms, watching those men laugh over cigars, while his mother sat outside in the cold waiting for the bus. That was the day Elijah decided, if he ever held power, he'd never forget what it felt like to be powerless. Years later, after clawing his way through college on scholarships and building his fortune through calculated risks, Elijah faced a different problem. In his world, the world of billion-dollar deals, it wasn't hard to find people who could smile for cameras and shake the right hands. It was hard to find people he could trust when no one was watching. He's been burned before. A business partner who siphoned millions from a joint venture. A publicist who sold private emails to a rival. Even a woman he once considered marrying, who, he discovered, had been tracking his net worth as if it were the stock market. These betrayals weren't random, they followed a pattern, and Elijah understood something most people don't. Character isn't proven when everything is going well. It's revealed when someone thinks they have leverage over you. That's why he started using what his inner circle called the integrity filter. It was a simple but revealing principle. Simulate weakness, see who stays honorable when they think you're vulnerable. The psychology behind it is rooted in a concept known as opportunistic behavior, a term used in behavioral economics. It describes how people sometimes act in self-interest when they believe they can do so without consequences. In other words, when they think no one's keeping score, masks come off. Elijah had run this filter on potential business partners, senior hires, even people dating his friends. Each time the results were consistent. About 80% would exploit the moment. Another 15% would stay neutral, but less than 5%, they chose compassion over advantage. And those were the ones Elijah built his life around. But there was another layer to this night's test, one Grace couldn't see. The women at that dinner hadn't been chosen by accident. They were recommended by individuals Elijah considered influencers in his professional orbit, people who insisted they knew women worthy of being part of his inner circle. This was as much a test of those influencers as it was of the women themselves. And there was one more shadow hanging over the evening, Elijah's late mother. She stepped past 5 years earlier, but in the quiet hours of the night, he still heard her voice reminding him, "Son, it's not about how people treat you when you stir strong, watch how they treat you when they think you stir weak." This dinner was in part a tribute to her, a living echo of the lesson she drilled into him in that cold lobby decades ago. Meanwhile, Grace's path to that dining room table had been equally shaped by invisible forces. She'd grown up in a small town in Mississippi, raised by her grandmother after her parents' lives unraveled from addiction. Grace knew how to stay unnoticed in dangerous situations, how to move quietly, observe, and help, without drawing the wrong kind of attention. She hadn't studied psychology or business, but she understood something many with degrees didn't, the weight of human dignity. Her job as a maid wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and for Grace, steady was survival. She followed the rules, stayed out of drama, and never forgot what her grandmother told her. Every person you meet is carrying a storm you can see, don't make the storm worse. And so, on that rainy night in the skyscraper's private room, two life histories, one forged in the heat of betrayal, the other in the quiet resilience of service, were on a collision course. Grace didn't know Elijah's test was born from a lifetime of watching people fail, the simplest measure of humanity. Elijah didn't know Grace's instinct to protect came from years of shielding others in storms they never asked for. But the moment was coming when those two worlds would recognize each other. The room had emptied of its elegant laughter, replaced by the muffled hum of the city far below. Only the clatter of silverware being cleared from the side table broke the silence. Grace moved quietly, stacking plates with the rhythm of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Elijah still sat at the head of the table, his drunken posture unchanged, his head tilted slightly, eyes low, the picture of a man who had lost control. Grace hesitated. Normally staff were trained to exit quickly once the primary guests had left. You didn't linger, you didn't engage. But something about the way he held his glass, still full, but untouched for the last 20 minutes, told her something was wrong. She stepped closer. "Sir, would you like some coffee before you go?" she asked softly. He didn't respond immediately. Instead he murmured something that sounded like, "Everyone leaves when they think you can help them anymore." Grace froze. The line felt heavy, not the kind of thing someone says by accident. Here's what that moment teaches us. We don't always get a neon sign pointing to a crossroads. Sometimes, it's just a sentence, a test wrapped in casual conversation, and our response decides everything that follows. Grace could have done what most would: smile politely, pretend she hadn't heard, and carry on clearing the table. She could have excused herself, thinking, "This isn't my business. I'm here to work, not to get involved." But she didn't. Instead, she set down the plates, pulled a chair just far enough to keep a respectful distance, and said, "Some people leave because they don't know how to stay when it's not easy." For a moment, neither of them moved. Elijah's gaze lifted, sharp now, the faintest trace of his mask cracking. He asked, "And which are you?" Grace didn't flinch. "I stay when it matters." It was a small sentence, but the room felt heavier afterward. She didn't know it yet, but those words were being recorded. And in Elijah's mind, the real test had just begun. The first phase, observing her instinct, was complete. The next would push her into a situation where instinct wouldn't be enough. That opportunity came minutes later. One of the other women from the dinner, Naomi, had left her silk scarf draped across the back of her chair. Grace picked it up on her way to the coat check, intending to have it sent back through the appropriate channels. But as she stepped into the hallway, she overheard voices. Naomi was speaking to a man in a tailored suit, one of Elijah's senior advisors. "He sits not all there tonight," she was saying, her tone light but dripping with implication. "If someone were smart, they sit get him to sign a few things before morning." The advisor chuckled, not unkindly, but without objection. "I shall see what I can do." Grace felt the scarf in her hands grow heavier. She could walk past, pretend she hadn't heard. She could take the easy road, the one most staff take when they witness something dangerous. Stay invisible. Keep your job. Or, she could risk stepping into a fight she hadn't been invited to. Every part of her training told her not to. This wasn't her battle. She wasn't paid to police conversations in hallways. People in power handled their own problems. But her grandmother's words echoed, "Don't make the storm worse. If you can stop it, stop it." Grace turned back toward the dining room. Elijah was still there, eyes closed, but his hand tapped slowly against the armrest, not the rhythm of a drunk man, but of someone thinking. She bent down and spoke quietly. "Sir, I think you should know, one of your guests is planning to get you to sign something tonight." His eyes opened fully this time, clear, focused. For the first time, Grace realized he wasn't drunk at all. That single action flipped the entire outcome. Because from that moment forward, Elijah wasn't just testing Grace, he was preparing to see how far her courage and loyalty would go when the stakes became public. And the stakes were about to get very public. "Thank you, Grace," he said, his voice low but sharper now. "Go ahead and bring me that coffee we talked about." Grace hesitated. Coffee had been a courtesy offer, but she realized this was something else entirely. It was a way of clearing the room, of giving him time to process and act without tipping off anyone outside. She left quietly, but as she moved through the kitchen, she replayed the scene in the hallway. The tone in Naomi's voice. The easy laughter from the advisor. The words, "I'll see what I can do." Grace wasn't a strategist in the corporate sense, but she understood human dynamics. She'd learned it not from books, but from survival, from growing up around people who said one thing in public and another in private. That's what that moment teaches us. Some forms of intelligence don't announce themselves with degrees or titles. They live in the spaces between words, in the microsecond shifts in body language, in knowing when to move and when to be still. Grace's hidden power wasn't charisma or networking, it was pattern recognition. She noticed things others didn't. A guest's glass left untouched despite constant chatter, a tone of voice that shifted only when certain names were mentioned, the way someone's smile tightened when a topic hit too close to home. Most people dismiss these as unimportant. Grace knew better. They were tells, signs of what people were really thinking. When she returned with the coffee, Elijah was no longer in the slouched, feigned drunken pose. He was upright, alert, and watching her closely. "You hear things," he said, more as a statement than a question. Grace kept her voice steady. "I pay attention." "Do you know how rare that is?" She didn't answer. She wasn't sure if he meant it as a compliment or a warning. Elijah leaned back. "Let me tell you something about the people who survive at the top, and the people who fall. Those who survive see the strike coming before the blade is in motion, and they know when to speak and when to act." His eyes didn't leave hers. "You acted tonight." Grace felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't the kind of conversation household staff normally had with the man who owned the household, but there was no condescension in his tone, only a level, evaluating calm. Then, without explanation, Elijah said, "Stay close. Don't leave the room until the others have gone." It was instead a request. Minutes later, Naomi reappeared with the advisor in tow. The air in the room shifted. Elijah greeted them warmly, still playing the part of the slightly tipsy host. But Grace noticed his questions were sharper now. He asked Naomi about her business proposal, watching her closely as she tried to feign surprise. He asked the advisor if he'd reviewed any documents she might have mentioned. The trap was invisible, but it was there. Naomi glanced at the advisor. The advisor hesitated just long enough to confirm everything Grace had overheard. Elijah let the moment hang, then smiled faintly. "We shall talk tomorrow, when I sit thinking more clearly." Naomi's eyes flickered, frustration masked with politeness, and she excused herself. The advisor followed, their exit brisk. When the door closed, Elijah finally exhaled. "You caught it before it reached the table," he said. "Most people would have let it play out. They think it's safer to stay silent." Grace said nothing. She'd learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than explanation. But what she didn't know yet was that this wasn't just about protecting him from an opportunist. Elijah had been watching her for months, the way she handled last-minute event changes, the way she managed tense guests, without them realizing it, the way she never joined in staff gossip yet, still knew everything worth knowing. He's seen this pattern before in bodyguards, high-level executive assistants, and war zone medics. Calm under pressure, plus selective speech equals strategic asset. And now, for the first time, he was considering something he rarely did, moving someone from the invisible class of workers into his circle of trust. But before that could happen, Grace would have to withstand the next phase. Because Naomi wasn't the type to leave quietly, and Elijah wasn't going to protect Grace from the fallout, not yet. He needed to know whether her calm was instinct or unshakable principle. The next morning, the estate was buzzing, staff whispered in hallways, phones rang more often than usual, and Grace noticed that her name was being mentioned in voices that dropped to a hush as soon as she appeared. By mid-afternoon, she knew why. The head of household staff, Mrs. Lennox, a woman whose authority was second only to Elijah's in the day-to-day running of the home, called Grace into her office. Naomi had filed a complaint. The claim was simple but damning. Grace had misrepresented events the night before, to gain Elijah's favor, and in doing so had embarrassed an important guest, and undermined a senior advisor. Grace sat still, letting the words wash over her. She recognized the tactic immediately. Flip the narrative before the truth can take root. Here sits what that moment teaches us. When integrity threatens advantage, those in power don't always attack your actions directly, they attack your reputation. If they can redefine you as the problem, they don't have to address the problem itself. Mrs. Lennox's tone was controlled but edged with warning. Naomi is well connected, Grace. I don't have to tell you how important relationships like hers are to this household. She claims you were eavesdropping, and that you overstepped your role. Grace's first instinct was to defend herself, to lay out exactly what had happened in the hallway, word for word, but she stopped. She knew that in a power structure like this, rushing to defend yourself too soon could look like guilt. Instead, she said, "May I give my account when Mr. Cross is present?" Mrs. Lennox's eyes narrowed. The request was within her rights, but it was also a move, one that signaled Grace wasn't going to be cornered in a side conversation. That evening, the situation escalated. Naomi returned to the estate, not for a meeting, but for a lunch with two members of the press Elijah occasionally entertained. She laughed loudly in the sitting room, her voice carrying just enough for the staff to hear her retelling the story. A drunken Elijah, a meddling Maid, and an unfortunate misunderstanding blown out of proportion. By the time Grace entered the room to refill drinks, Naomi's smile sharpened. "Ah, there she is," she said brightly, turning toward the guests. "The hero of last night's Sep's rescue mission. You still have to tell them the part about warning Elijah. It's Sep's priceless." The guests chuckled, unsure of the tension but sensing it. Grace set the drinks down without a word, but her silence was interpreted exactly as Naomi intended. Awkward, defensive, guilty. And then came the worst moment. Elijah entered mid-lunch. Naomi greeted him warmly, then with a theatrical sigh said, "I do hope there sits no confusion left from last night. Poor Grace here must have thought I was up to something. I'm sure she meant well." All eyes turned to Grace. This was the public breakdown moment, the kind that destroys credibility if handled wrong. Every instinct told Grace to explain herself, to insist on the truth in front of witnesses. But she saw the trap. If she spoke now, she'd look like she was disrupting Elijah's hospitality to defend herself. Naomi would win twice, keeping the focus on Grace and making her appear unprofessional. So she did something else entirely. She looked at Elijah and said, "If there sets any confusion, sir, I shall be happy to clear it up, in private." It was a quiet refusal to play the game in public. The lunch ended with polite small talk, but the damage was done in perception. Grace could feel it in the staff's eyes, in the coolness of the senior advisor, Sit's nod. She was now marked, the maid who caused trouble. When she returned to her quarters that night, there was a note under her door. "You don't belong in his circle. Leave before you're pushed." No signature, no explanation, but the message was clear. What Grace didn't know was that Elijah had been watching the entire exchange at lunch. He wasn't looking for her to defend herself in public. He was watching how she managed pressure when the room turned against her. And now, seeing how she'd handled it, he was ready to initiate the next step, one that would require her to stop simply surviving and start strategizing. The summons came just after dawn. A knock at Grace's door, followed by a message from Mrs. Lennox. "Mr. Cross wants to see you in his study." Grace's stomach tightened. Being called to Elijah's study at this hour meant one of two things. Either you were about to be fired, or you were about to be trusted with something you couldn't refuse. She took the long hallway slowly, each step echoing in the quiet. The heavy oak door to the study was already open. Inside, Elijah stood by the window, a mug of coffee in his hand, the city skyline stretching behind him. "Close the door," he said, without turning around. Grace obeyed. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he said, "Do you know why Naomi went after you so quickly?" Grace shook her head. "Because I overheard her." That's part of it," Elijah replied, finally turning toward her. "But the real reason is because you stir dangerous to her in a way most people aren't set. You see people for who they are, not for who they pretend to be. That's inconvenient for people like Naomi." He set the mug down and walked closer. "I wasn't drunk the other night. I was testing everyone in that room. I've been doing it for years. You passed without even knowing there was a test." Grace's eyes narrowed slightly, and the others failed. "They failed," Elijah confirmed. "Some out of greed, some out of vanity, some because they think kindness is a performance rather than a principle. Here sits what that moment teaches us. The most dangerous test is the one you don't know you're taking. That's when instinct, not calculation, makes your choice for you." He studied her for a beat longer. "You handled yourself well at lunch yesterday. You didn't defend yourself in public, which told me you understand the difference between winning the moment and winning the war." Grace hesitated. "But my reputation can be rebuilt," he cut in. "If you let them define you now, you still be boxed in forever. But if you stay quiet and collect proof, you can dismantle them in one move." He walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a slim leather folder. Inside were documents, financial reports, event transcripts, and what looked like printed screenshots of text messages. He slid it toward her. "This is Naomi Sepp's real work. Her connections aren't just social. She's been feeding sensitive information to people who use it to undercut my deals. I've been gathering evidence, but I needed a way to confirm my suspicions." Grace looked down at the papers. "Why show me this?" "Because you're the only one in this house who hasn't tried to leverage me for something," Elijah said plainly. "I want you to help me finish this, but it will mean staying in the crosshairs. It will mean more whispers, more false accusations. It will mean playing a role that convinces Naomi she's already winning, until she's not." Grace stood still, the weight of the folder in her hands. She could walk away, she could go back to her quiet duties, and hope the smear campaign faded, or she could step into a fight that had nothing to do with her on paper, but everything to do with who she was at her core. Her grandmother's voice echoed again. "If you can stop the storm, stop it." She met Elijah Sepp's eyes. "What do you need me to do?" A faint smile crossed his face, not of amusement, but of recognition. "First," he said, "you're going to let Naomi think she's broken you. You'll take a step back, avoid confrontation, and make her comfortable. When people like her get comfortable, they get sloppy. And when they get sloppy," he tapped the folder, "we close the door." Grace nodded slowly. She wasn't trained for this kind of strategic game, but she understood one thing: survival was about timing. And maybe for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving, she was positioning herself to win. As she left the study, the morning light cut across the marble floor, long and sharp, like a blade being drawn. The first move had been made. Grace understood Elijah's first rule immediately: make them comfortable. That afternoon, she began her quiet retreat. She avoided rooms Naomi occupied, spoke only when spoken to, and let her posture carry the weight of someone keeping her head down. Within 2 days, the shift was obvious. Naomi's tone toward her grew more casual, almost dismissive. The sharp edge of accusation softened into patronizing tolerance. It was exactly what Elijah had predicted. But behind the scenes, Grace was in motion. She kept a small leather-bound notebook tucked in the pocket of her uniform. Every overheard comment, every name Naomi dropped, every location mentioned in passing, she wrote them down. It wasn't gossip to her, it was data. She noticed Naomi favored certain calls in the garden terrace, where the wind carried her voice toward the service hallway. Grace would pass at just the right time, making it look like she was tending to the potted plants or adjusting the outdoor cushions. Sometimes she caught fragments. "Tell them we said moving on Tuesday," or "Elijah Sepp's too distracted to notice." It was never enough to convict, but like Elijah had said, when people like Naomi get comfortable, they get sloppy. Here's what that moment teaches us. Real power moves don't always look like confrontation. Sometimes they look like patience, positioning, and letting the other side build their own trap. 2 weeks into this silent climb, Grace noticed a pattern in Naomi's behavior. Every time Elijah was scheduled for an out-of-town meeting, Naomi's visits increased. She'd charm the household staff, ask questions about his schedule, and sometimes bring guests who clearly weren't just there for lunch. Grace reported each detail to Elijah, in short, precise conversations. He never gave her full confirmation, but she could tell he was assembling these pieces into something bigger. The first real crack appeared on a Thursday afternoon. Grace was clearing dishes from the library when she overheard Naomi speaking to the same senior advisor from before. It sets all in the draft. Once he signs, they still have control of the assets until the transfer is complete. It sets cleaner that way. No media mess. Grace didn't react outwardly, but inside every nerve was alert. She took the long route out of the library, so she wouldn't cross their line of sight, then slipped into the kitchen and jotted the exchange into her notebook. Later that evening she quietly placed the notebook on Elijah's desk, during a time she knew he was in the study. He didn't speak when he saw it, just flipped through, page by page, before closing it and meeting her eyes. "Good," he said. "We're almost there." Her role wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't without risk. Naomi had sharp instincts when it came to self-preservation. A few times Grace caught her studying her a little too long, as if trying to place an unease she couldn't name. But Grace countered it with deliberate humility, apologizing unnecessarily, offering to take tasks that weren't hers, even stepping away when Naomi entered a room. It wasn't submission, it was cover. The turning point of this silent climb came on a rainy Friday. Naomi was hosting an informal brunch for friends, though Grace recognized two faces from the background of photos Elijah had once marked in the folder, individuals tied to past deal sabotage. Midway through, Naomi took a call in the sunroom. Grace passed by with a tray and caught the words, "Once the account is moved, he can touch it without my signature. That sips the beauty of it." The rest was drowned out by laughter in the main room, but Grace didn't need more. This was the detail Elijah had been waiting for, a signature-based control clause. That evening, Elijah called her into the study again. "You've done well," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "We have one more step before we close this. Tomorrow, Naomi will hand me those papers. I'll sign them in front of her, and you'll make sure we have a witness who understands exactly what she's doing." Grace's brow furrowed. "A witness?" Elijah's smile was faint. "Someone Naomi trusts. Someone who will think they sitting on her side, until the moment they aren't sit." The trap was nearly set, but it wouldn't just expose Naomi's scheme, it would also reveal who else in Elijah's circle had been willing to stand by and watch him be taken down. And Grace was about to be at the center of the reveal. The next morning, Elijah hosted what appeared to be a casual working brunch in the grand dining hall. The table was long, polished and flanked by cream-upholstered chairs, the kind that made people feel important simply by sitting in them. Naomi arrived in a tailored white dress, her confidence radiating like perfume. She carried a slim leather portfolio, the same one Grace had seen her guard carefully for the past week. The guest list was curated, 3 senior advisors, 2 board members, and 1 family friend. Naomi insisted should attend, a man named Curtis. Grace recognized him instantly from Naomi's earlier gatherings. This was the trusted witness Elijah had hinted at. As the staff circulated with coffee and fruit, Naomi positioned herself at Elijah's right hand. Grace moved quietly in the background, her eyes scanning every reaction. Naomi tapped the folder. "I streamlined the transition documents. This will ensure your investments are managed seamlessly, while you take the time you've been needing." Her tone was sugary, but the edges were razor sharp. Elijah didn't flinch. He skimmed the top page, pen in hand. "You've really thought of everything," he said evenly. "Shall I sign here?" Naomi's eyes flickered with anticipation. "Yes, just there." Grace noticed Curtis lean forward slightly, watching the signature line. He thought he was about to witness Naomi's victory. But Elijah didn't sign. Instead, he placed the pen down deliberately, his gaze shifting to Curtis. "You've known Naomi a long time, haven't you?" Curtis hesitated, unsure. "We've worked together on several matters." Elijah nodded. "Then you'll appreciate the gravity of this." He gestured toward Grace. "Would you mind if my maid reads the clause on page 3 aloud? I think it's important. Everyone hears it clearly." The room went still. Naomi's smile froze. Grace stepped forward, her voice steady but unhurried. "Clause 7b, said upon execution of this agreement, all controlling rights to specified accounts shall be transferred solely under the signatory authority of Miss Naomi Bennett, without requirement for co-signature." She paused, letting the words hang, meaning she added softly, "Mr. Elijah would lose all immediate control over those assets." Curtis's brow furrowed. "Naomi, is that accurate?" Naomi let out a short laugh, too loud for the moment. "It's just a standard safeguard, for efficiency." But Elijah slid a separate folder across the table. Inside were Grace's meticulous notes. Every overheard conversation, every detail Naomi had let slip. There were dates, times, even partial transcripts. And next to each entry, Elijah had added verification from his own sources. "This," Elijah said, his voice low but carrying, "is not efficiency. This is theft." Coordinated, deliberate, and performed under the guise of loyalty. Naomi Sit's face lost its color. You stir twisting this. But Elijah cut her off. Grace, would you read the last page? Grace unfolded the final sheet, a formal statement of Naomi's planned transfer to an offshore account, signed by one of the men present at the table. She didn't need to say the name. The shock on his face told the room who it was. And then Elijah delivered the quiet kill shot. You see, Curtis, he said, looking directly at the man, when you came here today, you thought you were here to help Naomi close a deal. What you didn't state no, is that this meeting was for you. He turned to the board members. Everything is documented. This is the end of her influence, and anyone who stood with her. Naomi tried to stand, but Elijah's security had already stepped forward. She didn't shout, she didn't fight, she simply looked at Grace with a venom that could have burned through stone. Grace met her gaze without flinching. Here sits what that moment teaches us. A single action can flip the entire outcome, but only if you've done the quiet, unglamorous work to set the stage. The victory you see in public is built on countless invisible steps in private. As Naomi was escorted out, the room remained silent, except for the soft clink of Elijah's coffee cup, as he took a sip. Let's begin, he said to the remaining advisors. As though nothing had happened. The house felt different that night. Not louder, not busier, but lighter, like a storm had passed, and left the air clear enough to breathe again. Naomi's exit wasn't dramatic in the traditional sense. There were no shouted goodbyes, no slammed doors. Just the measured, efficient movements of security ushering her away, her portfolio left behind like a discarded weapon. But the ripple was instant. By the next morning, two of the board members who'd been quietly aligned with Naomi tendered their resignations. Curtis, the so-called family friend, disappeared from Elijah's circle entirely. Industry contacts whispered about the brunch incident, and within a week, Naomi's name was a cautionary tale in boardrooms. For the staff, the shift was more subtle. They still moved with the same quiet precision, still polished silver and folded linens, but there was a sense of relief in their steps. Grace noticed it most in the kitchen. Mrs. Henley, the head cook, placed a steaming cup of tea in front of her one morning and said simply, "You did right by him." It was the first time anyone on staff had acknowledged her role aloud. But victories come with a price. In the days that followed, Grace's position in the household became complicated. Elijah trusted her more than ever. She could feel it in the way he now sought her opinion in matters far beyond her duties. But trust of that magnitude painted a target on her back. Not everyone appreciated her new proximity to him. A few staff members, loyal in their own quiet ways, began to treat her with caution, as if she were no longer just one of them. And outside the estate, Naomi's allies whispered about how the maid had orchestrated the downfall. Grace understood the psychology behind it. Humans are wired to rewrite events to protect their pride. Naomi had lost not because she was careless, but because Grace was dangerous. Here sets what that moment teaches us. When you win by intelligence and integrity, some will see it as a threat rather than an example. It's not your job to fix their perception, only to keep walking your path. Elijah, however, was unmoved by the politics. One evening, he called Grace to the study. "You've earned more than just thanks," he said, sliding a sealed envelope toward her. Inside was an offer, her own small property on the outskirts of the city, fully paid for, in her name. Grace stared at it, unable to speak. "It's not charity," Elijah said. "It's an investment. You've shown you know how to guard what matters. That's rarer than money itself." She accepted the keys, but what mattered more wasn't the land. It was the unspoken acknowledgement that someone had seen her value, not as a servant but as a strategist. The public fallout for Naomi was brutal. The offshore transfer was halted, and legal investigations began circling her name. Former allies distanced themselves, claiming they never knew the full extent of her plans. But Grace knew the truth. They knew enough, and they stayed quiet until the wind shifted. And yet, Grace didn't celebrate her ruin. She knew Naomi's ambition had been built on a twisted version of a truth many women carried, that in certain circles, survival demanded manipulation. Naomi just chose to aim it at the wrong person. One afternoon, as Grace locked up the study, she found herself staring at Naomi's abandoned portfolio. Inside, among the contracts and correspondence, was a single Polaroid. Naomi in her 20s, standing barefoot on a sunlit balcony, smiling like she still believed the world could be hers without deception. Grace slipped it back into the folder. Not everything needs to be destroyed to be won against. Some things just need to be left behind. It was late, the kind of hour when even the estate seemed to exhale. Grace was finishing her rounds when Elijah's voice called from the study. Inside, the fire was low, its light stretching shadows across the shelves. Elijah was seated at the desk, not in his usual posture of command, but leaned back, reflective. "Sit," he said quietly. Grace took the chair opposite him. I've been thinking about something, Elijah began. The night before that brunch, I nearly went through with it, signed without hesitation. Naomi would have won, and if that had happened, the loss wouldn't just have been money. It would have been trust, dignity, the example I've tried to set for the people watching me. He paused, meeting her gaze. It sits easy to think victories come from grand gestures, but the truth? They come from quiet vigilance, from the people who notice what others ignore. Grace didn't speak, but something in her chest tightened. You reminded me, Elijah continued, that not every defender stands on a stage. Sometimes they stand in a kitchen doorway, or behind a tray, or in the corner of a room where no one bothers to look, and because no one sits watching, they see everything. Here sets what that moment teaches us. You don't need a title to wield influence. You don't need permission to protect what matters. You only need to decide that silence will not be your contribution. Elijah reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a simple leather-bound notebook, her notebook. This stays here, he said, placing it on the desk. Not because I need it, but because one day, someone else in this house will. And when they do, they shall read these pages and understand exactly how you won. Grace looked at the notebook for a long moment. It wasn't just paper and ink, it was proof. That strategy could be an act of care, that observation could be a form of leadership, and that victory didn't always mean crushing your opponent, but simply making their tactics irrelevant. Weeks later, the estate returned to its usual rhythm. Naomi's name faded from the daily conversation, replaced by the quiet hum of business as usual. Grace used the property Elijah gifted her not as an escape, but as a place for her younger cousins to stay while attending school in the city. She never mentioned Naomi to them, only taught them, in small ways, the discipline of seeing what others miss. As for Elijah, he didn't speak of the brunch incident in public, but those who had been there noticed he began inviting different kinds of people into his inner circle, people with humility, patience, and the capacity to think beyond themselves. To you watching this now, the story may feel like a battle between a billionaire and a would-be usurper, but it's more than that. It's a reminder that the people who shift outcomes are rarely the loudest in the room. They're the ones with the discipline to listen longer, to act later, and to move with precision rather than impulse. And if you've ever felt unseen, know that being underestimated can be your greatest advantage, if you use it with intention. My challenge to you: in your own world, your workplace, your community, your relationships, commit to noticing what others miss, not to manipulate, but to protect, to guide, to hold the line when no one else will. Because a single well-timed action, backed by quiet preparation, can flip the entire outcome. And when that moment comes, you won't need to announce your arrival. The results will speak for you. If this story resonated with your values, like, comment, and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs the reminder that power isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's patient.